Welcome back to Jacketsonline on YouTube, and I'm joined by another classic Georgia Tech player from my early era covering the team, Steven Sylvester, who was a linebacker on the flats from 2008 to the 2011. Is that right?
2011.
Yeah. So Steven is a guy I got to know a little bit during my time covering him. Got to know his family a little bit as well. So, and obviously he dipped his toe into coaching, which we'll talk about as we go along here as well, which was always very funny when you saw a former player come back and make a go at coaching. So, Steven, first of all, just how you doing?
Doing really well. Thank you for asking. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come on and talk about Georgia Tech, near and dear to my heart. So anytime I have an opportunity to talk about the alma mater, man, I definitely appreciate it. So very grateful for you having me on.
Cool. So let's walk back. You were committed to Chan Gailey the summer of, I think it was July of 2007, right?
Yep.
Obviously, the coaching change goes down. Union Grove had been quite a staple place for Georgia Tech recruiting at that time, and even for a few years after that. Just kind of walk me through kind of what happened and why you decided to stick with Georgia Tech and end up on the flats.
Yeah, absolutely. So in all actuality, Georgia Tech was my first offer. Back then, it feels like forever ago when I say back then. But, social media and recruiting wasn't quite what it was back then. I think MySpace was pretty cool. I think you had to have a .edu to have a Facebook. I don't even think Twitter was around. So a lot of the recruiting was done by phone call, people writing hand letters. I don't even know if that's a thing anymore, or phone calls. So at the time, I had a couple of teammates, a couple of friends of mine that were getting recruited. Kyle Jackson was one of them, who was very instrumental in the 2007 class, who was very heavily recruited. I believe he was committed at the time. And Chris Jackson from across town at Henry County High School, who I grew up with. We were good friends, and I knew that he had gotten an offer. And long story short, I used to play basketball in the summer. I went to Clayton State basketball camp, and I injured my toe. And my team was going to 2 7-on-7 camps that same week. I'm not going to say the name of the other school that they were going to, but they were going to another school. I was being recruited by that school as well. And I called the coach that was recruiting me, and I said, "Hey, coach, walking around in this air boot. I'm not going to be able to compete at the 7-on-7, but I'd love to come hang out, spend some time." And he said, "Actually, it's probably better if you don't come. Just hang, evaluate you throughout your junior year, your senior year, and we'll see how it goes. Feel free to come hang out at any games if you want to, but as far as you making the trip, probably not necessary." So I said, "Okay, fair enough." Made the same call to the guy who was recruiting me at Georgia Tech, Coach Smith. Gibbs Smith was recruiting me. So I called Coach Smith and said, "Hey, Coach, I injured my toe in this basketball camp. I had this air boot on. My team's supposed to come down there on Friday, but I'm probably going to sit this one out." He said, "Why?" He said, "Just come hang out, spend the day with us. It'll probably be pretty good for you just to come down and be around the guys." So I showed up. I had my air boot on. It was me and my dad. And Coach Nate Burton was driving us around on the golf cart, hanging out with Coach Smith. He took me up to Coach Gailey's office, and that's where they verbally offered me. So they were my first offer, and I always thought it's kind of unique that another school would tell me not to come. And not only does Georgia Tech tell me to come, that's when they extend me the offer. They haven't seen me do anything. So the relationship aspect stuck out a lot with Georgia Tech. People say somebody may forget what you do for them, but you'll never forget how they make you feel. And I felt like I was wanted at Georgia Tech.
So it makes a lot of sense, yeah.
So lo and behold, the season goes along, and Tech played Georgia on Saturday. They lost. I think the score was like 16-12 in 07. Coach Gailey came to my house. Him, Coach Smith, and Coach BJ came to my house Sunday for my in-house visit, and then he got fired Monday morning. And I had been committed since June, July. And I was like, good grief, what am I going to do? Because I had shut down all of that. My dad was no nonsense. As soon as you gave your word, that was it. So I had shut down everything else. And I was in the process of getting ready to open my recruiting back up. And I got a call from Coach Smith. He said, "Hey, don't do anything crazy yet. I think I know the guy who's going to get the job. If he gets the job, I think that our jobs are safe. And I think it would be a good idea for you to come." And then they hired Coach Johnson. And that's how I ended up at Tech.
What was it like the first time you met Coach Johnson?
It was very, what's the word I'm looking for? Everybody knows Coach at this point. It was very direct. There wasn't a lot of fluff. There wasn't a lot of nonsense. I remember Coach came in. He sat down at the table. He drank sweet tea. He really listened to me and my mom talk to Coach Smith. And he didn't say a whole lot, but you kind of knew that you felt the energy in the room, if that makes sense. So it was an intense meeting, but without him saying a whole lot.
So unlike Morgay, who I talked to, who's also in your class, you had a different perspective on things as a guy that was a defensive player going against the triple in practice. Just kind of what was that experience like, and then being there at the very beginning of his tenure?
Well, I had the opportunity to be around a lot of good guys while I was there. You know, a lot of good football players, and ultimately that's the reason that I ended up at Tech, was because I wanted to play with those guys. But those guys had a reputation for just loving football, regardless of who you were playing against, what the scheme was, what you were practicing, whatever it was. Those guys just loved to play. And, you know, I credit guys like Morgan Burnett and, you know, Derek Morgan and Daryl Richard, who you could say, hey man, we're going to the park to play football in 20 minutes at Piedmont, and those guys would show up in cleats and helmets. They just like to play ball. So that was the culture that I came up around. It didn't really matter who we were going against, because at the end of the day, it was all X's and O's. It was all blocking and tackling. And if you knew how to beat a block, you knew how to make a tackle, 9 times out of 10, you could probably learn the scheme that you were going against that week. But it was interesting being there in the beginning, because I was there on the back end, of course, of a lot of guys who had played for Coach Gailey. So just the mindset, I understand, was a little bit different from coming in from Coach Gailey to Coach Johnson. So you could tell that some of these guys weren't quite used to what they were going through or what they were doing. But I think everybody, for the most part, was on board because they kind of saw the vision. And if we bought in, we believed that we had the talent that we could be really good.
In those first 2 years, the staff was pretty stable with Dave and BJ obviously coaching you at linebackers and that thing. What was it like when you guys made that transition? They brought in Groh. I remember he showed up for one of y'all's bowl practices, and I thought that was pretty suspicious before Dave got fired. Just what was it like, I guess, going to yet another big shift there, because you guys go to the 3-4, you bring in Groh as this NFL guy. He's directly coaching you.
Mhm.
What was that experience like for you?
It was different. I had never had that much FaceTime with the defensive coordinator, because Coach Womack, you know, he was always around. He was obviously the conductor of the defense, but on a day-to-day basis, I talked to Coach BJ. Coach BJ is the one who gave me, you know, my assignments for the week. He was the one who told me what I was going to do. And then, you know, you go out there and you interact with the DC at practice, maybe a little bit in the building, but being in the room with the defensive coordinator, a guy that had been doing it that long at many different levels and had some success doing it, it was a little bit more intense than what we were used to. You know, the film breakdown, the film study, if I remember correctly, was just ages and ages and eons beyond anything that we had done. You know, we watched an extensive amount of film with Coach BJ and Coach Womley, but just the breakdown of Coach Groh, and, you know, we would be in there watching 1996 New England Patriots defenses. You know, some of our guys look like that, but not all of us look like that. So it was a little bit of a switch. It took some getting used to. I think a lot of the guys ended up buying in. And of course, after I left, you know, they had some success down there. Ultimately, it didn't end up the way that everybody wanted it, with Coach Groh kind of riding off into the sunset there. But I think that a lot of the younger guys that he had recruited kind of bought into it, and they were able to do some great things while he was there.
Was it as confusing as some of the guys let on? That's one of the things that a lot of the guys talked about before and after and during, that it was a little complex for the week to week of college football with the 20-hour rule and all that. Was that something that you noticed?
For sure. Just the amount of packages that we had. You know, you had your base defense, you had your nickel defense, you had your dime defense, you had your money defense. And all this was supposed to be incorporated within a 3.5, 4 day span, where you're mixing in special teams, you're mixing in lifting, you're mixing in study hall, you're mixing in class. But then you had this kind of extensive playbook with all these different blitz packages, all these different personnel. So it was a little bit complex for a 20-hour week. But that was just the nature of the game, the nature of the beast.
What, like, when you look back on your career, kind of what are maybe like a game or two that like really sticks out to you, that this I remember this moment, or like something that really kind of caught your eye?
Oh man, I have plenty of those. I can kind of walk it through year by year. I remember as a freshman initially, I wasn't supposed to play. I was supposed to redshirt. We were kind of heavy at linebacker that year. And I remember we played Jacksonville State week 1, and we didn't even dress. We weren't even on the sidelines. All the red shirt guys, all the transfers, we sat in the bleachers in Bobby Dodd. And I remember that game, if I'm not mistaken, I think A.T. Barnes maybe broke his ankle or something like that, severely fractured it. I think Brad Jefferson may have broke his wrist. And I was the next guy up. So I remember we played on a Thursday night, and that was when they had Ryan Perilou. Like, he was supposed to come in and light us up. but that we played them on a Thursday night, and Coach BJ actually called me Friday afternoon and said, "Hey man, if you got some time, swing by the stadium today." So I went by the stadium, and he said, "Well, you're dressing." He said, "You're not going to play, but we're going to dress you. We're going to have you for emergency situations." So he said, "You know, you're going to come up from the scout team. You're going to try to learn the scheme, and you'll be on the bus." And then he was very adamant about saying, "But you're not playing." So the next week we played Boston College, and I remember flying up, and I thought it was the coolest thing because I had never chartered a flight before. I remember pulling up, getting on the plane. I ate more food on that trip than I had ever eaten in my life. I just remember being extremely full Saturday morning for, I think it was like a 1 o'clock kickoff or something like that. So I remember standing on the sideline, just kind of taking it in. And out of nowhere, I hear Coach Monken yell, "Where's Sylvester at?" And I'm looking around like he can't be talking about me because I'm not supposed to play. And he says, "Hey, man, you're in on kickoff." Went out there lining up on kickoff because I had practiced maybe with the 13 kickoff or something like that, just so I knew where to line up and the timing of the kicker and whatnot. And I ran down and I made the tackle. First play ever on college football, ran down and made the tackle. So that one sticks out because it was my first game and it was my first tackle. Also that year, I very, very distinctively remember going to Clemson and Virginia Tech and remember thinking this is what college football is. So I remember walking into the stadium and everybody's screaming at you. If I'm not mistaken, both games were orange outs. The entire stadium's orange. And I remember just being an 18, 19-year-old kid looking around the stadium thinking like, wow, this is really it. So those stick out from my freshman year. Of course, in 2009, when we upset Virginia Tech, that was a very fun game to be a part of. 2010, I'm not going to lie to you, was a little bit of a blur. That was probably the worst year that we had when I was. So nothing really sticks out in my mind. I do kind of remember the Middle Tennessee State game because I remember there was some jabber back and forth between Josh and their quarterback because I think they had competed against each other in high school. So we had taken that one kind of personally. And then my senior, I can't leave out 2008 beating Georgia. I mean, that goes without saying. And then my senior year when we upset Clemson at home on homecoming, that one sticks out in my mind just because I think they were number 4 at the time. My roommate, Tevin Washington, was the quarterback. He played phenomenally that game. And I remember being so proud of him, the way he played, and then just the way the team played. I was extremely proud of everybody, and we were able to get that win. So all those stick out in my mind.
Is there like any kind of what ifs? Like when you think back on those times, a lot of the guys talk about the different ways maybe they approached life or just being caught up. I mean, you're 18 to 22 years old. Everyone's buck wild basically at that age. Like just is there anything you think about now? Like I was like, wow, I wish I did this or did that, or are you just cool with like how it played out?
I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because I'm very cool with the way that it played out. I think that Tech afforded every opportunity that I've had in life, whether it be professionally, personally, I like to credit back to Tech. So I think any decision that I made that I was down there, it was supposed to happen. But of course, I look back and wish that as a 19, 20-year-old kid that my work ethic was a little bit. I took it as seriously as I probably should have taken it. Probably eating the way that I was supposed to because I ate horribly while I was down there. But I was 19, so I'm gonna burn this off at practice or walking around campus. But if I would have taken care of my body the way that I was supposed to, or that I know now as a 34-year-old man, I think that some things may have been a little bit different. But for the most part, I don't have any regrets outside of that.
Cool. And then talk to me about kind of the decision to get into coaching because I find it always interesting talking to the different guys that get into that field. Obviously, Tevin tried to as well. Just what made you decide that you wanted to try to be a coach?
Honestly, in conversation with Coach Johnson, I think Coach and I have a different relationship, and I think that it's based on the fact that I didn't play directly for him because I was on the defensive side of the ball. Obviously, as the head coach, he's in charge of it all. But he was very, very, as everybody knows, heavily involved in the offense. So, I'd see him in passing, we'd speak, he'd pop in a defensive meeting here or there, or he'd come to us on the sideline and say something. But that was pretty much the nature of our relationship. When I went back, I'll never forget. I had graduated, had done pro day, it didn't work out. And the first job that I ever got was Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and I did not enjoy it at all. And I remember just going down to Georgia Tech just because that was home. Like, that's where I felt comfortable. So I remember sitting in the room, and if I'm not mistaken, it was right after I think Coach Groh had been let go. Coach Kelly had taken over. I went and spent some time with Coach Kelly, kind of shared some things with him that I was thinking. And then he was the one who actually suggested, hey, I think you need to go talk to Coach and let him know. So I walked into Coach Johnson's office, chopped it up with him for a little bit. And I said, Coach, man, I'm At this point, I think I was 23. Yeah, I was 23. I said, hey, coach, I'm 23. I'm young. I feel like I still have a lot of football left in me. I don't know if I want to play, but I just don't know what to do with all this. Like, I just have so much football. That's all I care about. That's all I think about. And coach actually said, hey, have you ever thought about coaching? I said, no, sir. I said, that really hasn't crossed my brain at all. And he was like, well, if you think about it, it's a lot like playing in the NFL, except you're not getting hit every day. He said, you have cross country, you don't know if you're guaranteed from year to year. It's the exact same thing without the physical part of it. So I asked him, I said, well, if I wanted to get into it, what's the best route to go? And he said, well, you'd have to probably be a GA. You have to be a graduate assistant. You have to get into grad school, and kind of laid out the steps for me. And I thought that the conversation died there. Lo and behold, this had to be around October-ish of 2012. Coach Buzz Preston called me in January of 2013 and said, hey, are you still interested in coaching? I said, yeah, I kind of think I am. He said, call Coach Johnson. He said, don't mention a thing about coaching. Just pick up the phone and call him. So I called Coach just to kind of talk to him a little bit. And he said, hey, I remember you and I had a conversation about 2 months ago about you being interested in coaching. I said, yes, sir. He says, that's something that you'd still be interested in. And at this point, I was at the airport enterprise. So I was working 7 days a week, crazy. I was like, absolutely, coach. He said, well, I want you to come down, talk to me. We'll see what we can make happen. Because I think Paul Rice was a GA at the time. He was getting ready to leave, and they were going to have a spot opening up. So I went down, talked to Coach Johnson. And while I was standing in the office, he called. I don't know who he called on the phone to this day, but he called somebody and said, yeah, we're getting ready to have a GA position open up. I want Steven Sylvester to get it while I'm standing in the office. So, of course, I had to go through. I had to take the GRE. I had to get into school. Like, it wasn't handed to me. So I had to take the GRE. I had to get into school, got the score required. So I took it in January. I think I got my official acceptance in February, and I started the week before spring break. So I always say people have a lot of opinions about Coach. The way that I look at him is completely different because I got to know him on a different level outside player-coach relationship. I was in the room with him every single day.
What was it like? You worked on the offensive side of the ball. What was that like to make that transition too? Because you were learning basically like a specialty. You were learning a specialty skill, almost like learning that offense. It was totally different than being a as a defensive guy, being a defensive guy, or even if you were just in a more traditional NCAA spread or whatever. What was it like learning from him and learning that offense?
It was different. It was pretty cool actually because I came in a transition period. So when I came in like I said, I think my first week was like March of 2013. So when I showed up, Coach Bohannon was telling me everything that I needed to know. Hey, this is what you're going to be responsible for. This is who you're going to coach. I'll teach you everything that you need to know, and everything's going to go off smoothly. And I had a decent relationship with Coach Bohannon, kind of the same thing, see him in passing. And then 2 weeks later, he's the head coach of Kennesaw State. So now I'm kind of back in limbo, and it was myself, and at the time it was Liam Klein, Coach Klein, was kind of involved. This was before he knew he was going to Kennesaw, and Coach Johnson. So we were the ones who were kind of in charge of the quarterback D-back room. So I was with Coach all day, every day. So that's who I learned the base of the offense. And then, of course, we brought in Coach Cook a couple of weeks later. But being on that side of the ball, it gave me, I guess, a better understanding of the thought process behind why Coach does what he does, what's important to him to watch, what's not important to him to watch, how he's able to call plays, because when I got into it, I had heard horror stories about GAs printing off, the big border size papers with play calls and whatnot. That's kind of what I went into it expecting, not knowing that Coach Johnson does everything off a sticky note. But just to know how much work that he put, how much he understood defenses, how much he understood angles, how much he understood, player counts, just so he could go out there with 4 plays on a sticky note and be like, all right, we'll just build off this. We'll see what works, and then we'll just kind of roll from there. So learning it from him, it made the transition a little bit easier, but I also had great guys in the room that were willing to help out. Coach Preston was in there who had done it forever. Coach Seawalk was in the room who had done it forever. Coach Owens was in the room who had played for it and done it forever. So all those guys in the room just paying attention, being a sponge. Preston Pearson had been around it forever. So just having the opportunity to learn it from those guys, it made the transition a lot easier as opposed to somebody coming in and I was by myself, so to speak.
What was it like watching the play calling and that aspect of it during games? I imagine that had to be kind of eye opening to see, and really the adjustments in game, even just the minutia of like what Coach Johnson did in terms of just maybe changing a blocking assignment or whatever, and how that would affect their running game.
It was really cool to see all that kind of play out in real time. And I have thousands of stories that I can tell. I'm going to share a few with you today.
Sure.
Gave everybody, different responsibilities. So he, of course, was kind of looking at the big picture of things, but he would assign, one coach, hey, this is what you're supposed to pay attention to. This is what you're supposed to pay attention to. So that way he could go to anybody at any given time and say, hey, Ella, what's the safety doing? So that way he knew, well, if he's rotating this way, then maybe the play action's there, or maybe if the corner's forcing, maybe I have this play here. So he had everybody on the same page as far as what they were looking at, while his head was spinning about, okay, how can we gain some sort of advantage over these guys, based on what they're doing. Not anything that we're doing crazy, but just taking advantage of what they're doing to our advantage.
And I guess kind of how did that ramp up into you wanting to go take a job and be an assistant coach? Like, what was that process like?
I think just understanding the amount of time that coaches put in, and realizing in the grand scheme of things how important that stuff is. Um, I gained a greater love and a greater respect for the game of football, because initially, players, we show up. Of course, we watch film, we practice, we lift weights, but then we show up on Saturdays, we play the game, and then we go home. And sometimes you don't think about it again until Monday when you have to watch the film. Just knowing the amount of time and care that coaches put into it during the week to put out a great product at the end of the day. So I really enjoyed the behind the scenes work. If we run this play, we have a high chance of scoring on this play. So like that type of stuff is Bentley. Can you give it a minute? My dog saw somebody. He hates us.
That's okay.
But just seeing, the amount of time that was put in on a day-to-day basis, that's really what attracted me to it. And then secondly, being able to give back, I guess, the advice that I wish that I had gotten. I told you I wish that I would have taken care of my body. I wish that I would have eaten better. I wish that I would have slept better. I wish that I would have, just paid more attention to the ins and outs. So being able to give that knowledge back to guys that weren't, some of them were my teammates at Georgia Tech. But then when I got a course down to Jacksonville University, those guys weren't too much younger than me. So I felt like I had an in with them where they would listen to me, and it didn't sound like some old guy that was being a hater. I was just trying to give them as much game as possible to kind of point them in the right direction.
How weird was it being a coach with, you were not removed far enough, like where, I mean, there were tons of dudes that you played with still on the team and in that room. And what was that experience like, just having to be a little bit of an authority figure to those guys that you're only maybe a year or two older than?
It was an adjustment, so to speak, and that was one of Coach Johnson's biggest concerns. If I would be able to be, the authority figure that they needed, because my sole responsibility outside of making copies and breaking down film was checking class. So I had to go make sure that those guys were in class, in the very classes that I was trying to, figure out a way. Maybe I don't have to go today, or maybe I can leave a little bit early. Those are now the same classes, the same guys that I'm responsible for checking on. So it's a little bit weird because, like you said, a lot of those guys that were on the team, especially when I got back in 2013, I graduated in 2011. So like guys like Aaron Joe were still on the team, Darren Waller was still on the team. Like a lot of guys that I had essentially seen grow up. I remember them coming through the recruiting process, coming to camp, them hanging out with us, and then ultimately them signing and being on the same team in the weight rooms and the workouts together. Now I'm responsible for making sure this guy's in class. So it was a little bit of adjustment, but to those guys' credit, I think they understood what I was trying to do. And at the end of the day, I wasn't trying to quote unquote jam them up. I was more so just there to do my job. That's all I was trying to do.
Were you still on the staff in 14 for the
Yeah.
14 season? Yeah. So that was your second year as a GA.
Yep.
So what was that experience like, going with that team and the offense and seeing Justin kind of blossom into, I remember talking to Brian Cook a lot, like in the background, even during the 13 season, like he was just like, yeah, you got to see this kid when he gets his shot. Like he can really do it. It's just, can he hold up physically? That was the big question with him. But like, what was it like watching that thing just kind of explode the way it did that season?
It was special because a lot of those kids were great athletes. A lot of those kids were good people. But just watching the work, because of course 2013 didn't go how everybody. I mean, we were 7-6, but it didn't go how everybody expected it to go. So going into 14, I think that everybody kind of had a different hunger about themselves, and you saw that. You saw it early. As soon as off-season workouts started, there was a different energy in the room. There were a lot of guys that, it was funny because those guys were young when I was there, but now they were the ones who were kind of taking the reins and taking charge. and we had a lot of good talent that knew that they could be pretty good, but just to kind of watch them all put it together. Justin was a phenomenal athlete, but I say the real star of the show that year were the slot backs and the position players that he had around him, because a lot of those guys had played a lot of football. They knew a lot, and they were able to help Justin out, get in and out of certain situations. So Justin was obviously the key piece that made it go. But those guys just being around, kind of giving him, for lack of a better term, that security blanket to know that these guys are going to make me right. I can go out here and play fast. I can go out here and play free. But I have guys that are going to be able to get me out of some jams. So you had guys like, B.J. Bostic, Deion Hill, Charles Perkins. Of course, you had St. John and Zach in the backfield. You had Darren and DeAndre on the outside. You had Shaq Mason. I mean, you had a bunch of guys who had just played so much football. So to watch that class come together and really do it and take it to the level that we were kind of used to it being, it was fun. I'll go on wax and say this, though. The 2014 team wouldn't beat the 2019. I put that out there for everybody. I'm going to end the debate. They wouldn't have beat us.
Well, the defense was much better in 09, just overall. You had Derek Morgan and Morgan Burnett, and there were some players on that. The defense in 14 was more opportunistic with the secondary making some plays and Jeremiah, but like it wasn't as talented as that. But I thought the offense was a little more dynamic in some ways because of Justin's ability to throw the football, but he wasn't Josh Nesbitt either, running through people, and you didn't have a John Dwyer. No offense to St. John or Zach, but Dwyer was special, man. Like, and having him and AA on one side running was definitely a lot more than what a lot of teams had.
For sure, yeah. 21 was different. 9 was different. 8 was different. I mean, we just had a bunch of good players on that team, and I said 14 was phenomenal, and I really enjoyed that entire run. That was probably up there with the most fun that I had being down there. So kudos.
What was it like? You go to Jacksonville, and was that the jump from there to coaching in Jacksonville?
Yes, it was.
And what was that experience like being coach? Obviously, that ended really sadly for you, but and got you out of the business. But just what was it like being a college football coach at that level, where you've gone from being at Georgia Tech, where you had all these resources, you're in the ACC and all this stuff, and then you're sort of on your own. I've talked to a lot of your former teammate like David Sims and different guys who've gone through those levels of coaching, but what was it like being at the ground level of something like that?
It made you appreciate everything that you had at Georgia Tech, because you always can talk about the things that you don't have. What looks cooler at this school, whether it be a Nike uniform or whether at that time it'd be an Adidas. You see, I'm still wearing the Russell, but if it was a uniform, but you kind of lose sight of everything that you do have there, everything that you have at your fingertips, as opposed when you go to a Jacksonville University. I remember showing up day one at JU, and I mean, I still talk to a lot of those guys to this day. I still have a lot of great friends from that JU staff, but I remember pulling up on campus not knowing where I was supposed to go. And being at Georgia Tech, I'm used to the Edge building. I'm used to, the football stadium with the glass. So I pull up and I see what I now know is the College of Business at JU, but I thought that was the football office because it's directly in front of the football field. So I remember walking in day one, opening the door and kind of looking around like, okay, where am I supposed to go? Where's the administrative assistant? Who's going to point me in the right direction? Now, I remember I just so happened to bump into a lady who was walking in the building. I said, yeah, I'm looking for the football coach's office. Are we the first or second floor? She said, no, actually, you're that building over there. And I remember looking out, and it was just a pre-engineered metal building, just kind of off to the. And I was like, oh, okay. And I remember walking in, I think like it had rained and it had flooded. So all the carpet had been pulled up. We didn't have internet in the building. So I remember like working off the hotspot on connecting my laptop to my hotspot on my phone so that way I could go out on the recruiting trail, and just kind of doing it from the ground up made you appreciate all the resources that you have at a Georgia Tech, even though some people may complain and say, oh, well, it's not this. It's also not that either. So, just being there, learning it from the ground up, having to do it from the ground up, it made you appreciate all the resources that you have. But like I said, nothing but love for those guys at Jacksonville. I still talk, to Coach Shields. I talk to Coach Simi. I talk to Trent Steelman all the time. So made a lot of great relationships while I was down there. And it kind of just shows you the power of the Tech network. The way that I actually got the job was through Coach Cook. He was the one who picked up the phone and called Coach Shields and said, "I have a guy who's getting ready to graduate. Do you have a spot for him?" You know, our first year defensive coordinator was Richard Ellerson, who had coached with Coach Johnson years and years ago, and we had guys like Greg Newhouse on the staff. So just being a part of that Georgia Tech quote unquote option family afforded me my first opportunity to go down to JU and coach. And obviously it didn't end the way that we wanted it to, but through Georgia Tech, I was able to go down there and foster new relationships.
I guess talk about how it ended. It's one of the saddest stories. I remember this was before COVID. They just shut down y'all's football program altogether.
It was the wildest thing because it literally fell out of the sky. We had no idea it was coming. So usually our season ran up until the week before Thanksgiving. So we played our last game the week before Thanksgiving. So I remember we played on Saturday. I can't remember who we played. I think we lost. But then we went into the Thanksgiving week wholeheartedly thinking, okay, we're going to come back from Thanksgiving. We're going to hit the recruiting trail. And we're going to address some holes, some needs that we had. Because we had a couple of good players down there. We had a problem with attrition down there because it was so expensive to be in school. So we always knew that we had to sign a bunch of kids. And how we were going to get them to come to camp was always, a Tetris game in itself. Going on Thanksgiving break, my wife and I had drove to Savannah for a concert on Saturday. Went to the concert Saturday, drove home Sunday. We had a team meeting Sunday, just kind of outlining the rest of the semester. We're telling the guys, hey, we're getting ready to go out on the road. You got to make 7 workouts before you go home. Make sure you guys are doing your finals, going to classes, study session. We're probably not going to see you before you go home for Christmas because we're going out on the road recruiting. When you come back, this is the day of the team meeting. This is the day you have. So we lay out everything for them. So this is Sunday. Monday morning, I get up and I drive to Savannah because my recruiting area was kind of that southeast corridor of Georgia. And I came up a little bit to Metro Atlanta. And I'm actually recruiting. It's funny, I was recruiting Gavin Stewart at the time, who was at BC.
Oh, wow.
So I drove up to BC, to talk to him, Coach Britt, whatnot. Spent a little time in Savannah. Drove back home. Typed up my report because I was preparing to come to Atlanta the next day. So I laid down. It's probably 8:30 at the time. My wife Jasmine's like 7.5 months pregnant. We had just bought a house in Jacksonville. So I go to sleep. So she wakes me up probably about 11. She says, your phone's been ringing off the hook since you fell asleep. So I get up and I check, and I have maybe like 5 or so text messages and 3 or 4 missed calls from Trent Steelman. So I called him back, and I knew at the time he had 2 young kids. He was recruiting South Florida. So I thought maybe he had got stuck down there. He needed me to come get him. He needed me to go check on his wife and the boys. So I call him back like, hey, man, what's going on? He's like, bro, have you checked your email today? I said, nah, man, I've been asleep since 8 o'clock. He said, you may want to check it. So I check it while I'm on the phone, and we have an email from the athletic director, which we never get. And it was just, hey, mandatory meeting tomorrow. If you guys are in town, I understand some people are out recruiting. If you're in town, you need to be in person. If not, here's a Zoom link provided. And me and him, we stayed on the phone for an hour and a half trying to figure out what this meant. So we're thinking, okay, we're a non-scholarship school. It's the height of recruiting season. I know our basketball team, if I'm not mistaken, had just made the jump to a new conference. So we're thinking like, okay, maybe we're getting ready to go scholarship. So we need to tailor our recruiting a little bit different who we're going to get. We knew it wasn't good while me and him are having this conversation, and Coach Shields sends a group text with a screenshot of the email that says, did anybody else get this? So the fact that I had no idea what was going on, I was like, yeah, bro, I don't think we're going scholarship. I don't think this is going to be good. So they call us in. We get there the next day. They had us meet in the College of Business, which was directly next to the football building. Coach Shields was in the president's office, and then the players were in the basketball arena. So they had all of us spread out across campus at the same time, having 3 different meetings, getting the same news. So you can imagine they're telling us they're shutting down football. They're telling Coach Shields they're shutting down football. And they're telling the kids they're shutting down football all at the same time. So we have this meeting, and we go back to the field house, and we're all just kind of sitting in there like, okay, what do we do now? And of course, all the kids start flooding in. They're boohoo crying because they don't know what's coming next. And a lot of these kids, like I said, we had a lot of good football players on that team. Calvin Turner Jr. is the one that comes to mind because he went to Hawaii and had a great career after he left JU. But then you had some kids who this was their one and only shot to ever play college football. They're not going to play again after this. So you have those kids like, okay, what do I do now? Because I knew that I wasn't an NFL guy, but I also thought that I had 3 more years to play football. So, you're having those tough conversations with them. But all in all, I think it worked out for everybody. I think the tough part that nobody saw coming, like you alluded to, was the COVID part of it, because that completely threw a monkey wrench in everything for us. We were, like I said, my wife was 7.5 months pregnant at the time. We had just bought a house in Jacksonville. And I remember I wanted to go into administration. So I picked up the phone. I called the athletic director. I said, hey, man, essentially, you just fired me. You're still paying me through July. I want to get to administration. Let me come in the building and do something because I can't sit here all day. So I was able to go back into the building. I was working in the athletic building, and essentially we had a conversation that, in so many words, at the end of the coaching contract, if everything went the way that it was supposed to, I may have had the opportunity to come back and work in the building. And then when COVID happened, they furloughed half the university and then reevaluated department size. So a job
Jeez.
I thought I was going to have, I ended up not having. So that's, once again, I was able to use my Georgia Tech network, make some phone calls, and that's how I was able to get into the career that I'm in now. So it was a whirlwind of about that happened December, and then I started, with Holder Construction in July of 2020. So there was like a 6-7 month span where I was just kind of flying by the seat of my pants.
And having a new baby and all that, I imagine it was pretty brutal. Some brutal nights for you during that.
It was, man, but it all ended up working out. It all ended up working out.
So tell everybody what you're up to now.
So now I work for Moeller Purcell Construction. I have to say hello. One of my, he's the new COO of our company. His name's Steven Sylvester. He is a avid. He graduated from Georgia Tech. Avid, blog reader. He loves everything that you do. But I told him if I ever got the opportunity to talk to you, I'd say his name on here. So shouts out to Steven, man. But I work for Moeller Purcell Construction Company. I'm a superintendent with him now. So we're based out of Atlanta. Our offices are in Alpharetta, and we do a lot of different projects all around the city. So just in charge of running a job right now. Essentially, I just finished up one that I was on for about 11 months. It was a senior living facility that we built from the ground up. And now I just got, my new assignment. I'm down south of the city. So, just using those Georgia Tech connections. Once again, everybody that's in the building, for the most part, that's a decision maker, is tied to Georgia Tech in some sort of way. So once again, just letting the brand, the logo do its thing, letting it run wild. Of course, being qualified for the position, but having that GT behind my name, it never hurts. So that's where I'm at now.
Do you miss the coaching at all, or is it you okay with it?
A little bit, a little bit. I'd be lying to you if I said I'm not locked in every Saturday, watching what the Yellow Jackets are doing, or, watching some of my buddies that are still in it. I still talk to Preston Pearson all the time, wherever he's at, rooting for him.
Where's Preston now?
He's at Stanford now. So
Okay.
So he's out there. It's funny. He was one of the groomsmen in my wedding. I live in Georgia. He lives in California, and I ran into him in Jacksonville, Florida last week. I was hanging out. I don't know if you guys remember this name, Blast from the Past, Richard Watson, who was also my roommate. Yeah. My family and his family are extremely close. So we went down to spend time with him. We just so happened to be at the movies, and Preston bumped into me, not on purpose, at the concession stand. So he's at Stanford now. So I still stay locked in. I'm still plugged in, watching the guys work. But truth be told, I like being dad now. I like being husband and dad. Working with a company like Moeller Purcell has allowed me the opportunity to be just that. I get a chance to come home. I get a chance to see him every morning before, I go to work. I get a chance to put him in bed every single night. So I miss it from the game day aspect of it. I miss it from being around the guys. But I wouldn't trade being here talking to you in my wife's office of all places with my little boy and then helping her. I wouldn't trade that for the world. So I'm having a blast doing what I'm doing now.
I mean, that's awesome. I think that's one of the toughest aspects of all this is that people don't realize the toll of coaching and the 80-hour weeks and the road. And it's funny, I was on the road for camps this summer and I was texting Coach Key and he goes, "Wow, you're actually like a football coach right now with how much you're out on the road." He goes, "This is what it's like." Because I was complaining. I was like, I haven't been home. I was on the road for, 16 of 20 days or something. He's like, "Oh yeah, this is like what a football coach does, Kelly."
For sure.
I thought that was pretty funny.
You're in the thick of it, man, because that's exactly what it was. But like I said, I miss being around the guys. I miss game day. But outside of that, like I said, I wouldn't trade this for the world. I do miss some of the stories that you get just from being around each other. And this is an exclusive, Kelly. I've never told anybody this story before. But being around those guys, you learn the ins and outs of people. And one of the ins and outs that we had about Coach Johnson while I was at Tech was if you hadn't gotten cussed out, you weren't in yet. So if you've never been yelled at and called outside of your name, you were not in. And I'll never forget the first time Coach Johnson let me know that. It was my first year as a GA. I don't know if you remember this game. We played North Carolina at home. I think it was the third game of the season. It was a torrential downpour outside.
Oh yeah, the second half it poured the whole second half of the game.
And my job was to keep track of how many plays Zach Lasky and David Sims played, because those were my two B-backs at the time. He wanted a 2-to-1 ratio, David to Zach. But every time I'd write down, who was in the game on my play card, it'd wash away. So I had no idea who had played, how many plays, how many carries people had. And Coach used to like to run between like 70 and 75 plays. That was like his sweet spot. If he could run 75 plays a game, he felt pretty confident that we were going to win that game. But I can't remember if it went into overtime or if the defense got a couple of late turnovers. But anyway, we ended up running like 95 plays that day. We ended up running like 20 more plays. And I remember getting in to grade film the next day. And Coach Johnson never looked at his play sheet. I mean, his grade sheet. Not one. In the 2 games that I had been in, he never once took a glance at it. So I remember going through it with Coach Cook, telling him, like, hey, Coach, just so you know, David Sims played 75 plays yesterday. And Coach Cook, yeah, he was like, we're probably going to get yelled at in the meeting, but he was like, just don't say anything. He was like, don't say anything about it, but if it does come up, I'll take the blame for it. I said, all right, Coach. I said, I don't mind putting my neck out there for you. And lo and behold, we're going through the grades, and we had even gotten through all the offensive guys. And Coach Johnson just so happened to pick that grade sheet up. And he looks down at it and says, that can't be right. He said, it says here David Sims played 75 plays yesterday. And before Coach Cook can say anything, all the coaches sat around the big round table, and the support staff kind of sat around the outside of the table. And before Coach Cook could say anything, Coach Johnson stood up from the seat. He pointed directly at me and said, you have one job. Sat back down. So this is painting the picture for where I'm going. So I can't remember. I think we played Virginia Tech the next week.
Yep.
We lost that game. It was the Thursday night game.
Yep.
And we played Miami the following week at Miami. And I remember going in, it was late third quarter. I remember looking down at my play sheet, and I was like, I got to find Zach Lasky 15 more plays before this game is over. I'm not getting screamed at. So it's late third quarter, and I think we're down by maybe 10 or so, something like that. And Thad had been taken out of the game, and they had put Justin in. And this was kind of like the Justin Thomas show of this, where they were letting him kind of do his thing. And I remember, all right, I'm sending Lasky. When Justin goes in, I'm putting Lasky in with him. So they go in together. And we called sprint out pass to the right. I remember this like it was yesterday. Called sprint out pass to the right. And I've told Zach Lasky this story, so he knows that he owes me something. So Zach Lasky goes out. He misses the block. Justin gets crushed. He fumbles the ball. Lasky picks it up, kind of scurries back to the line of scrimmage. It's 2nd and 9 or whatever. And Coach Johnson screams on the headset, whose man was that? Nobody says a word. He says, run it again. Clockwork, run the same play. Lasky misses the block. And this time, Justin's like, I'm not getting crushed. He just throws the ball in the air. Miami picks it off, runs it back for 6. So Coach is going ballistic on the headset. Nobody's saying a word. And he goes, for the last time, whose man was that? Still nobody says a word. And out of the box, Coach Cook says, I think that was the B-backs man, Coach. And I'm like, oh, no. Coach probably, 15 yards down the sideline from it. He goes, who was the B-back? I said, Coach, it was Lasky. He goes, why was Zach Lasky in the game? He was like, he doesn't block well since. I mean, he's going on this tangent. And instead of just eating it, I said, Coach, you remember 2 weeks ago how when we played North Carolina, you said you wanted the play ratio? And he loses it on me again. So now at this point, we're down by 17. It's probably mid-4th quarter. We're not going to win the game. Vad's done for the day. I think Justin had a concussion, so we're down to Timmy Byerly.
Yep.
And then we put Timmy Byerly in the game, and I ask over the headset, once again, being young and dumb. I say, Coach Cook, you want to go back with you want to go back with Lasky? And before he can get the words out of his mouth, Johnson goes ballistic on me again. He says, no, I don't want to put Zach Lasky back in the game. He said, he just got our quarterback killed. Do you want to line up and play quarterback, Steven? I didn't realize how headsets worked back then, Kelly. So my mic was still hot. So before I had a time to turn my microphone off, I say, you just put Byerly in the game. The game's over anyway. Probably 60 yards down the sideline from me. And I'll never forget, Preston Pearson is standing in the middle of us. And he hears it. And he's writing something down, and he looks up. He turns and looks at me like, what did you just say? And he turns, and Coach Johnson is sprinting down the sideline towards me. And he grabs me. He says, I make $3.2 million a year. Of course I know who I just put in the game. And he pushes me. So we lose the game. And after every game, whether it was home or away, I always talked to my dad on the phone. So I'm checking the bus, the guys are getting on, and my dad calls me. So I'm talking to him. He says, "Hey son, how you feeling?" I'm just like, "Yeah, Dad, it was a tough game. We'll get him next time though." Just kind of giving him the rah-rah speech. He said, "Son, that's not what I'm talking about." I said, what do you mean, coach?" He said, "Sorry getting your ass chewed on TV today, son. It was on Coach Johnson was untucking your shirt. So I just wanted to call and make sure you were okay." But that's the type of stuff, having those stories, because after that, Coach Johnson and I were gold, but I just had to get cussed out for the first time. So just having those stories and being around the guys, that's the type of stuff that I miss.
Oh, that's awesome. I appreciate it, Steven. It's been great catching up with you, and look forward to seeing it. We'll drop in your info in the bottom of the thing if people want to check out what you're doing now and reach out to your company. And thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. Anytime, man. And, go Jackets.